The outdoor sports sector has experienced explosive growth over the past decade, with both traditional sports markets and emerging markets getting on board. But what's next for outdoor sports? Where could brands find the next growth opportunities? And in a market dominated by a handful of power brands, will we be likely to see new brands coming in? Hi, I'm Jane Singer, and thanks for joining me here on A Seat at the Table. I really do appreciate your taking the time out of your day to listen to the many outstanding people who are guests on the show. You are an important part of our global community, which now has grown to include 96 countries. We're going to be adding a new feature to this program, and I'll be telling you more about it at the end of the podcast. Today I'm speaking with Danay Lea, Chief Triage Officer at Fluid State, where he helps outdoor sports brands solve business growth and development challenges. He's served as strategic advisor to Burton Snowboards, as well as an advisor to the CEO at Abu Dhabi Securities Exchange, CFO at Commercial Bank International, and Program Director at ANZ. In this episode, Danay talks about the next big target market for outdoor sports, why small brands can find big opportunities in the outdoor sports market, what many people entering the industry misunderstand about it, and what he's learned from working with a range of successful outdoor sports brands. Before we get started, if you're a supply chain executive who'd like to finally put an end to information overload and get a simple, concise summary of key market developments and shifts, then the current situation in sourcing is exactly what you're looking for. To get immediate access, head on over to thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net. You can find all the details over there, and I'll also put a link in the show notes. Now let's sit down with Danay and find out what's next for outdoor sports. Well, Danay, I am so happy to have you on A Seat at the Table. Outdoor sports has just been exploding over, well over a decade, right? And I think it's interesting to be able to talk to someone like yourself with hands-on expertise and to be able to take a deeper dive and really understand from an insider's point of view where there are opportunities, what some of the challenges are, what some of the things that we're overlooking in the industry. So perhaps we can just dive in and start by taking a look at where do you see the big opportunities for the next 3 to 5 years? I mean, where are we going to go from here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on. There's been a tremendous amount of growth in the outdoor sector over the last, in particular, 10 years. And, we'll continue to see that in the coming, years and decades ahead. And I think the opportunities in particular in that sort of short to medium term is really how to capitalize and leverage on sort of the great outdoor unlock that has occurred through COVID. People have rediscovered the outdoors in many respects, and there's been a huge demand for people to experience the outdoors to even their more local surroundings and take that time. I guess people are spending a lot more time at home, which means that they're happy to explore their local environment during the week as opposed to just on the weekends. And people are prioritizing their lifestyle and their health. And this is in part because they're not spending so much time commuting to and from the office. They're able to restructure the hours in which they work during the day. So I think the opportunities for the next 3 to 5 years is really about how you do unlock that desire for the outdoors and continue that momentum that people have had for the outdoor environment. We have some broader challenges in the industry, around sustainability and how to engage people around sustainability. And I think that particular aspect of the industry is going to continue to see a lot of traction and people are willing and engaged around sustainability for a lot of brands and products. And I think that in of itself as well is going to drive a lot of engagement for people. So between those two components, there's a large number of other trends which we're seeing within the industry as well that are starting to surface and have been surfacing for some time. In particular, the acceleration of the move from bricks and mortar to direct-to-consumer models, and the way in which both big and small brands have reacted to that. You've seen the way that Nike has pivoted their particular business, in particular, away from their kind of bricks and mortar distributorship model, more to their wholly owned and direct-to-consumer models. We'll see Foot Locker get hurt in their financials as a result of that. So I think there's some really key opportunities coming up, but most of all, it's just to keep encouraging people to be in the outdoors and enjoy the outdoors as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think that you're right. People have discovered the great outdoors where we had become maybe too sedentary prior to the pandemic. We didn't have that motivation. So I think that's a really good thing. When you look at active sports, Do you see specific niches within that you feel are poised to grow at this time?
I think, to be fair, the urbanization of sports is really starting to come to the fore. 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of the marketing and a lot of the aspiration around outdoor sports was very much focused on how to be as extreme as possible. Were you climbing Mount Everest? Were you going to base camp? All of these sorts of things. And now really you're starting to see a lot of these brands and opportunities recognizing the fact that for a large part of the community, the consumer base, it's really about, have you been out for a 5-kilometer run? Are you enjoying your time outdoors? How do you engage your family in the outdoor activities? And I think from that perspective, we're starting to see brands really understand that people just want to have functional products that they can utilize in the outdoors that make them feel good and ultimately allow them to enjoy as much as possible the outdoors. And, not everybody needs a $1,500 jacket to be able to enjoy a hike through the mountains near their hometown. So we're starting to see people play into those particular demographics a little bit more.
I think that's a good point that you brought up because, yes, initially when a lot of this momentum picked up, it was really, like you said, focused around extreme sports, partially because they make good photo ops, right? They're going to be covered a lot more on all the different media platforms because they are extreme. But you're right. There are a lot of people who are never going to be climbing Everest, and maybe that's a good thing for Everest because I understand the traffic there is worse than in downtown most cities. I think it's interesting that people sort of overlook the fact that the average consumer just wants to do something that's outdoors, fresh air, achievable physically for them. It's interesting you bring that up.
I think there's still an opportunity for that, I guess, the sharper, pointy end of the stick when it comes to that marketing and aspiration. I mean, for me personally, I'm a very keen snowboarder and mountain biker. And absolutely, do I love seeing Travis Rice on, enormous mountains and Jeremy Jones on enormous mountains doing what they do and have an enormous amount of respect for these guys. And also, do I aspire, maybe not at my age, but do I aspire, to be able to do those sorts of things? Absolutely. But I think we're starting to now see another trend that's coming through within the outdoor sports industry, which is really around an individualization of product and experiences and tailoring those sorts of consumer experiences to different niches within the market, as opposed to having a sort of a one-size-fits-all consumer experience that's being pushed out there.
Yeah, that's really a good point. But it leads me to ask what's happening with niche brands and a lot of indie brands, because if you look at the active sports market, it really is dominated by a few very, very big players. And that's all very well and good, and they do an excellent job, which is why they've gotten that big. But are there opportunities for indie brands to come in and sort of create, like you say, a little more personalized experience for consumers?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's a number of reasons why I think that there's a huge amount of sort of white space for smaller brands, indie brands, and niche brands, because for one, there can sometimes be a perception in the outdoor industry about, the big corporate behemoths, the Nikes of the world, which make amazing product, but they are an enormous entity and organization. And often what you see is really passionate outdoor people who they see a problem, within their own sport. And then they set about trying to make this incredible product to solve for that particular problem. And that problem is not shared only by themselves. They're scratching their own itch, absolutely. But ultimately, they create, really incredible products, and they get out there into the market and they find a home for that particular product in the market. And what we do here at Fluid State is really kind of help those companies to grow and expand internationally and to be able to connect them with international markets and take that next step. But, back to your question, ultimately, there is absolutely space for these brands to thrive. People are very, very willing to look at, if we come back to things like sustainability, if you're a brand that is, very focused on local production or sustainable forms of production, people are willing to pay for that now. We did go through a period of time where it was very much lowest common denominator, cheapest cost for highest quality product. But one thing that we have definitely seen that's been accelerated by COVID, but certainly had started to change over the last 5 to 7 years, was people's willingness to make purchasing and buying decisions based on things that are not just around price. It was very much being conscious around the impact that these companies were having in their communities, conscious about the impact that they were having in the environment, what sort of advocacy these kind of companies were playing. And so quite small companies can really carve out a nice niche for themselves and ultimately become quite large brands if they get it right. I mean, you just have to look at a company like Arc'teryx, which was based out of Vancouver.
Right.
That's now been sort of gobbled up, but that's had an incredible growth story. On Running, the shoe company out of Switzerland, that was also just some really passionate outdoors people who decided to make a better shoe, and they solved for that problem themselves. And then along the way, have now created a US listed company that is doing incredibly well. So definitely, just because we have these very large companies that seem to dominate the market, what people don't realize is the outdoor sector is enormous and it's growing. And so there's absolutely opportunities for these niche brands, for the smaller brands to dominate. And I think that's going to continue to evolve.
That's really good to hear, because I think there's a market stays fresh when you have new entries coming in. Not that we don't appreciate, like you said, the behemoths who are in there and who obviously have raised the bar on all kinds of different standards in the industry. But the fact that you have new brands coming in, it brings energy and excitement into the market. What do you think people who are entering the sector misunderstand or don't understand specifically about the outdoor sports industry?
I think people misunderstand many aspects of just starting a business full stop, let alone the outdoor sports industry itself. But, I think, most people will tell you that it is a grind at the beginning, and, it is very difficult, and you do definitely need to have a purpose around your brand and what you're trying to produce. So I think people misunderstand that just because you have a great T-shirt or a great product, you still need to engage your consumers in the right way. You still need to create a brand story. You still need to be able to tell that story effectively, and ultimately understand that there's many, many factors in launching that brand that are going to be critical to your success. Just because you make a fantastic new ice axe or a great new ski doesn't necessarily mean that that's a guarantee of success as well. So, there's a lot of elements that need to come through, and I think very quickly you're able to now, with the wonderful sort of technology that we have, you can get a small business up and running very quickly. Like the administrative side of it and getting to the point where you have a DTC shop front is super easy with the likes of Shopify, et cetera.
Right.
And you're probably also going to get some level of revenue happening fairly quickly if you know what you're doing around things like Facebook marketing and Instagram marketing, et cetera. But then how do you then scale that to the sort of size that you start to get some benefits from the synergies that come from that sort of size? So I think people misunderstand that the learning curve or the curve of growth is probably quite quick at the beginning, but then can very quickly taper out and get drowned out by a lot of the other noise that is out there. And I think, companies need that opportunity to help understand how they grow into that next phase and next stage of their delivery.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point, because people don't realize that. In the beginning, you get caught up in the momentum, right? You've developed this new product. You have sort of this small community that really gets what you do. And when you try to expand that out to scale it, you need to work a little bit harder to communicate the message. And like you said, to also understand how you build your supply chains and manage all the various complexities, right, of running a business that's above a certain level.
Yeah, and I think 5 or 6 years ago, some elements around that supply chain was probably a little bit easier than it is right now. Sort of as we feel like we're on the tail end of COVID. 5 or 6 years ago, it was super easy to get some product and some demos done out of a factory in China or Vietnam, have that shipped to you in the US, Australia, or Europe, and be able to get your momentum rolling in that regard. But I think it's far more challenging at the moment, not just because of the physical supply chain challenges, but then also the supply chain perception issue that we are now starting to see within the industry, where consumers are expecting you to have a more responsible supply chain ethos. And so that is also bringing in some new and interesting dynamics to the industry as well.
Yeah, certainly the level of certifications that you have to have and the complexity of different laws around consumer protection and amongst different trade barriers and so forth have definitely complicated things. What do you feel at the moment is probably the biggest challenge from a supply chain point of view? We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Look, I think timing, and depending on which particular sort of part of the outdoor industry and how that cycle works, if you are an existing brand and you've really been, I guess, stuck on this idea of just-in-time inventory management and ordering, I think really now people are having to be much more deliberate and purposeful around the way in which they do, manage their inventory and also think about their number of SKUs, right? Previously, you could have a very broad range of product that you were delivering into the market. And now with the supply chain issues, you probably need to start prioritizing and really thinking about what's giving you, the greatest level of engagement with the consumer, what's giving you the greatest revenue return, to be perfectly honest. And I think these challenges around inventory management are becoming far more significant. And, from that perspective, it really comes down to understanding your business incredibly well, understanding which products and the way in which they contribute to your bottom line. But more importantly, which are the products that are resonating the most with your consumers and customers, because the cost of supply chain has increased and therefore you want to optimize and maximize what you are actually bringing in through your supply chain from different parts of the world and understanding what alternatives there might be to that particular supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Like you said, we could be a little more careless before, but nowadays, everyone has to tighten up on that supply chain. And at the same time, you don't want to be carrying excess inventory because that's risky. But as we saw through COVID, if you were cutting it too close, then you risked having no inventory because things are all jammed up. So, it's definitely...
Good luck buying a bike in the US or Canada last summer, right? It was almost impossible. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Managing that supply chain nowadays has gotten crazy complicated. Now, when you're looking at recent mergers and acquisitions in the industry, what do you think? Kathmandu took over Rip Curl. There's certainly been a lot of acquisitions. A lot of big brands are, trying to grow through acquisition. How do you see that impacting or shaping outdoor sports?
I think it's really healthy because it shows that people see the value in the outdoor sports industry and are willing to invest in buying these wonderful brands and great brands that have been built from the ground up over a long period of time. I mean, Doug and the guys at Rip Curl, it's a 50-year-old company, and they were very deliberate about the way in which they sought out a buyer. And I know that they had some interest from private equity companies, and they ultimately declined that interest, in part because they were very concerned about how the values and the ethos of Rip Curl was going to be protected through any acquisition. And, for good and bad reasons, the PE industry has sort of had a bit of a reputation of pumping and dumping brands. And, Rip Curl very much didn't want to have that scenario and situation. So they were very deliberate about who they selected as a partner. And that's why Kathmandu was such a great choice for them. And likewise for Kathmandu, buying Rip Curl was a great opportunity for them to expand their consumer focus and consumer interest and meld the two together. And they're both fantastic management teams. And it really gives an opportunity to create some synergies. And, I think the brands that are going to do quite well at the moment through M&A are the brands that have a really great heritage story. And a heritage story doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have been around for 50 years, but certainly have an interesting story as to how it was established and what that authenticity is. And I think one of the things that people look for in brands at the moment is an authentic story and a level of authenticity about how and why it engages in their consumers and customers. Because The reality is, if you want to start a t-shirt company or even a board short company and compete against Rip Curl, you can go and find a factory within a couple of weeks to produce board shorts for you, and you can throw up a website and get this out there. But how do you tell that story, and how do you engage, and what is your differentiation? And so for somebody like Rip Curl, somebody like Burton Snowboards, somebody, in these sorts of spaces that have been around, Channel Island surfboards as well. These guys have all been around for 40, 50 years, and they've been able to build up a really great story. On running, it's a much newer brand, but it also has a great story that's allowed it to grow to where it is. So I think overall, M&A means, and an active M&A business or industry within the outdoor sports industry is an incredible opportunity. And I think it means that people see the value and the interest in the outdoor sports industry and the future potential growth of the outdoor sports industry, because there is a great opportunity here to continue to activate people into the outdoor sort of arena and environment, and to make the most of that. So companies like VF Corp, very active in this space, and most of these big sporting conglomerates are looking at how they can continue to engage the consumer.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because when you're a small brand, you tend to, like you say, be built on having this heritage story, engaging a lot with your particular consumer. They know you, they feel like they're part of you. And then through acquisition, oftentimes that sort of gets diluted right out of the company, and it's more about mass producing and scaling and so forth. What advice would you give to corporations when they acquire some of these indie brands, so that they can, on the one hand, make it work within a big corporation, and on the other hand, not lose that personality, right, that made them who they are?
Yeah, I think really understanding what it is that you're buying in a company when you are acquiring them, you to not think you're just buying a great product, because ultimately, let's say with Rip Curl, you can buy Rip Curl as a brand. So you're buying their logo, you're buying their name, you're buying their history, and you're buying their product as well. And it would be very easy for that to ultimately get diluted. And because people forget that the ethos of that particular brand often comes through the people that work in that brand, the people that believe in that brand and have driven that brand for a long period of time. So, my advice to these companies that are going around and acquiring smaller sort of indie businesses or smaller businesses is, it's often the founders and the managing directors and the head of sales and the head of marketing, which have really been able to build that value in the consumer. And so, doing an acquisition is very easy to say, well, we're going to create synergies by cutting costs, by absorbing their marketing department into our bigger marketing department, absorbing their sales function into our sales function. And that's how you can create some synergies, increase EBITDA and everything else. But ultimately, you lose some of the texture of that company, the fabric of the company when you do that. And I'd really encourage those companies who are acquiring smaller businesses to really protect and nurture that talent within their own organization, and to make sure that you're not losing that sense of identity that comes with that particular brand. And look, there's been plenty of brands that have unfortunately gone down that path and have experienced a dilution of the quality of their brand simply because they lost that sort of soul of the brand. And ultimately, that's why people love those brands, is because the consumer identifies with that particular brand, because they feel like it definitely represents who they are, their aspirations, and the way in which they want to travel their path through this world. And once it becomes part of a huge, big conglomerate, people then sort of see that corporate ethos seeping in. They lose interest, and they start trying to find other brands that will sort of serve their interests and desires a little more.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that happens. And you're right. It's critical to be able to balance, right, the business side of it, the corporate side of it, with also having that respect for the personality of these individual brands and what they bring to the market. As someone who's had a leadership role in the industry, what do you feel is the biggest thing you've learned? I mean, from the time you entered into active sports from on the business side till now, what do you feel has been sort of the biggest learning?
Look, I think for myself, it's just how to keep the passion alive and how to keep enthusiasm alive when, even though you might be running businesses and the numbers are real and, the revenues are large, the costs are large, and there's always a lot of difficult decisions to make. But one thing that is fantastic and that I see over and over again is that the businesses that are succeeding are the ones that are able to keep it fun and keep it passionate and stay close to that, because that ultimately comes through in product design, it comes through in marketing, it comes through in sales. And having that affinity and connection with the outdoor sport that they're focused on, whether it's snowboarding or skiing or mountain biking or running, is really, really key. And I think you see that in the successful companies and the way in which they market themselves. And a lot of the industry has changed to this focus anyway, but most of the successful brands are not marketing themselves based on the feature of their product. They're not showing a new shoe with a new sole or a great new ski and telling you what are the technical features of the ski. They're selling you a lifestyle. They're selling you an experience. They're trying to put you in that moment. If it's 15 seconds on Instagram or 30 seconds on a TV spot or a newspaper magazine, what they're trying to do is in that moment capture your imagination and take it away somewhere else just for 10 or 15 seconds and put you into that experience. The brands that are resonating are the brands that have been able to do that very successfully and make people just want to drop what they're doing. And, for me to stand up from my desk right now and go out for a run or find a way to participate in the outdoors and get the blood pumping in the right way. So I think from that perspective, keeping it fun, keeping it passionate is really the biggest thing that I've seen as a success point in the various companies that I've assisted over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring that up because we sort of forget about that. You get into it because you're passionate about that particular sport. And then as it becomes a business, oftentimes people find, oh, this isn't really too much fun anymore. I'm just in the midst of, it's just another business, right? It's just another Excel sheet. So I think that, yes, that's a good point that you have to also keep the energy there.
Yeah. And look, I can understand why, right? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, passionate outdoor people, they make fantastic products. They didn't set out to be business moguls. They didn't set out to be people who are running multi-million-dollar businesses globally. And we all have some limits to our abilities or some limits to our understanding and knowledge. And I think that's why it's really important to understand, like, this is not fun anymore. Right. Why is it not fun? And some of it can be solved by bringing in expertise, bringing in understanding from people in other industries and within the industry as well to help solve particular business challenges and business problems that might be presenting themselves at that time. And from our perspective here at Fluid State, that's what we do. We try and make sure that we're solving business problems. We're trying to keep these businesses in that sort of flow state, that fluid state, their ability to continue, finding the synergies, continue to find the passion and the fun and the enjoyment and grow their brands to their greatest potential.
Very, very important. And it is important that people recognize that at a certain point, it probably pays to bring in people who have that business expertise that can help you get to the next level. Danay, you've shared so many interesting things. Where can people connect with you? Where can we find you?
Sure. I mean, the easiest way is just through the website at fluidstate.com and email contact details are there. And, we're active on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. So.
All right. Well, I'll definitely make sure that all of those links are in the show notes. And I really want to thank you for joining us today. It's just been great. I've learned a tremendous amount. And yeah, you make me want to get outside and get into that fresh air.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate your time as well. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we're adding a new feature. If you've ever listened to a podcast and thought, I have a question, well, now you can ask. We'll be letting you know about upcoming guests on our show, and you can send in your questions. Also, you can ask questions after the show, and we'll forward them to our guests for feedback. If you'd like to participate or just want to learn more, head on over to our website at seatpodcast.com. That's SEAT podcast.com for all of the details. The links will also be in the show notes. You can also leave any thoughts, feedbacks, or suggestions there, and yes, I will read it. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Jane Singer, and I will see you in our next episode of A Seat at the Table.